Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture. I hope you're doing well wherever you are, and I hope you sense the presence of the Lord with you. And before we really dive in, I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts with you. I don't know if I've made this clear enough, but the reason I'm teaching this class is because I've been around teenagers, adolescents, for more than 20 years in ministry in some form or another. And I am absolutely unwavering in my conviction that the only way for a flourishing whole life for teenagers is through a meaningful encounter with Jesus, a transforming encounter with Jesus, an integration into the body of Christ, to move into the conviction, the belief, and the confidence that they are full participants in the kingdom of God, in life the way it was meant to be, and that they go out into the world formed as agents in the kingdom of God with other fellow agents in the kingdom of God to live life the way it was meant to be. And one of the reasons I want to teach this class is because I want you to feel equally convicted and convinced, but I also want you to feel better equipped, inspired, motivated, and determined to either do ministry with that sort of conviction, ministry to adolescents, or if you're not in ministry directly with teenagers, to have some sort of influence wherever you are in the ministry setting where you are, so that we take ministry that seriously to this subset of the population. Because again, I just have not seen any other way where life is lived the way it was meant to be, except through Jesus for teenagers. So this is why I'm in this class, and this is why I hope it is a meaningful experience for you. So let's transition now into thinking about the developmental process for teenagers, for adolescents. That we need to understand adolescent develop in a pretty significant way. Because again, I said before, the goal of youth ministry is not about building a big youth ministry. It's about adoption into the body of Christ. And that may result in a big youth ministry. That's fine. But youth ministry all by itself is not enough really to address the significant needs of adolescents and their development. So here's the reason why this is important. If you're in ministry to kids, you need to understand adolescent development. But if you're not in ministry to kids, you need to understand the significant developmental needs that are going on in the life of kids. So, for example, if you're ever going to make the case for youth ministry, like in the final project options, that would certainly be something you would need to be able to approach from a developmental perspective. But what if you're going to lead a parents' meeting somewhere, or to a group of interested adults to make the case for why we need ministry? Adolescent development has to come into play in making that case. Or if you're just sitting down one-on-one with a teenager in your youth group somewhere, or as an interested adult in the life of a teenager who just feels so unusual or freakish or like they don't belong, you need to be able to understand developmentally what's going on, so you know how to say what's normal and why it's normal. So again, it won't come as a surprise to you to say it's hard to be a kid today. And one of the reasons, as we said last week in our lecture, is that for adolescents, you have to become a self essentially all by yourself, on your own. And that's even more complicated because the support structure to do this has decreased exponentially over time. Now, if you've become or come through adolescence in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, then this is essentially a normative thing that we have to figure out on our own how to become ourselves, how to answer that question that Katie wrestled with in last week's lecture. Be yourself, but I don't know who that is. Who am I? A fundamentally challenging question. But the reason that I went through all the effort last week to show you this history of the self was so that you could see that even though it's normal for us to expect that we have to kind of do it on our own, that's not the way it's always been.
So even though contemporary psychosocial theory would describe it, and any textbook that you read would essentially describe things like this is the challenge of being an adolescent today. It's not. I don't think it's normative. I don't think it's the way it should be. So what I want to do is give you a picture a little bit of some shifts in culture, even in the last couple of generations, that'll help make that picture a little clearer, and that'll give us some context for thinking about some very specifics about the psychological aspects of development. So how are we going to do this? I told you before, and I've said already, that contemporary theory about identity, answering the question, who am I, is an identity essentially would be like the stabilizing, guiding, integrated function of a person. At the same time, identity has depended on stability and the consistency of a social environment, and the presence of that environment that's more or less uniform. It coordinates its values so that they're accessible to everyone. But because goals and norms and roles and definitions fluctuate from one social situation to another, identity, as we are going to see, has come, or at least as we've come to understand it, has really shifted in its functionality. It's become very difficult to be an adolescent today. So traditionally, identity is dependent on an environment that we would say best categorized as what we call primary groups. The groupings where adolescents gather or live out their life that we call primary groups, and those are contrasted with groups we call secondary groups. Well, here's the characteristics of each of these. There's groups that have primary characteristics, and there are groups that have secondary characteristics. The primary characteristics would be things like intimate face-to-face interaction, common activities, common value orientation, gatherings that are the source of an individual's social nature and the source of the stabilizing rules and values needed in order to become an integrated core, or have an integrated core and become a self. Secondary groups, their secondariness, it would be like this. They're more impermanent relationships, casualness of contact. There are fewer ties of sentiment. They're socially more impersonal. They're not completely impersonal. They just tend to be less personal. And there's less clarity of group values and norms. They're just typically not the place where values and norms are accessed. And so the compelling kind of location or groupings that adolescents gather in would be the peer group or their family, or to a lesser extent, but still importantly, their community or their neighborhood, where they have a lot of associations. So what they need are existence in these groups with more primariness to them instead of secondariness. So I would say maybe traditionally your community might have kind of resided here on a scale where your community, your neighborhood, would exhibit more primariness than it would secondariness. The peer group would be the same way. The peer group would tend to exhibit more primary characteristics and less secondary characteristics. So, and the family, of course, would be right here, the place that exhibits the most primariness in its characteristics. So, altogether, let's say this would be in the 1940s or 1950s, that you tended to be in a stable family environment, characterized by face-to-face interaction, common activities, common values. Your peer group was the same sort of way. And then also your community or neighborhood. You tended to be known in your community and neighborhood. It wasn't just your parents that were a force for guiding you in consistent values or behaviors, but it would have been other parents or people in the community because they knew you, they knew who you were. And that had a significant effect on helping people understand and grow into who they were. But over time, things have changed. So in the past half century, the ways of perceiving, valuing, and feeling about ourselves has shifted or altered a lot, particularly in Western society and especially in the family. So I think I've mentioned David Elkind before, a psychologist from Tufts University, who's written a lot about the shifts over time in adolescence, our understanding of adolescence, and also about the family. So he would say that during this time period, this would represent the modern nuclear family as he describes it, often kind of portrayed idyllically. If you're from America, from the West, it would be sort of the Leave It to Beaver version of the family. This portrayed as a refuge in a demanding world. But that family has been replaced by what he would call more of a postmodern, permeable family that reflects much more of an openness, a fluidity in the roles in the family, a lot more flexibility, complexity, diversity that allows for a more contemporary lifestyle. This will play out then, so in more contemporary terms. So, or maybe the 1980s, 1990s, kind of where we are. We have these same groups here as we've had in the past, but there's been a bit of a shift. Communities and neighborhoods as a source of stabilizing values have begun to shift now, and they're seen as less and less relevant in terms of their primariness. So neighborhoods and communities are much more fragmented. There's much more impermanent or casual contact. Historically, the secondary groups would maybe have been our schools or maybe sports teams or other social activities that we participate in. Now we live in a much more fragmented world, and there's a great deal of fragmentation that's gone on in our neighborhood. So, oftentimes, especially in suburbia, as that's proliferated in the U.S. over the last 40 or 50 years. I mean, you pull into your house, into your garage, and close the garage door, and there's no front porch, and there's no sidewalks, and there's just not even a lot of interaction. So you can actually live in neighborhoods for years and years and years and never even know who your neighbors are. And this is quite common nowadays. So community neighborhoods are not places of common value or value orientation or even value distribution. It just doesn't occur that way anymore. Not as a surprise either, the modern nuclear family, much more permeable and flexible, more typically disintegrating or unstable, and so it shifted from being exhibiting more primary characteristics as now exhibits more secondary characteristics. And where do you think the peer group goes? Well, everybody longs for or needs primary groups with primary characteristics. So our observation has been psychosocially that the peer group for adolescents has actually shifted in this direction, and it begins to exhibit more primary face-to-face interactions, more common activities, and it begins to be a source of stabilizing values or norms. But that doesn't mean that the peer group has the resources and the history and the experience and the wisdom to really offer legitimate values and norms that will lead to an integrated whole self. It just fills the void, but it doesn't have the social capital or the resources in order to distribute it to members of the group like a community would, or even like family would, an extended family would. Nonetheless, what it tells us is that adolescents can't really become a self by themselves, and so they'll fill the void with something that will at least offer a semblance of primariness, even if it's not traditionally what has been required, and even if it's not essentially enough in order to become a whole integrated self. So what this tells us is that there's a changing landscape that impacts adolescent identity, and the lack of continuity in the social structure around them does have an impact on identity for adolescents, answering that question, who am I, to some extent or another, because there is this loss of a sense of common values and ways of being, behaviors, and roles in the larger community, and there's essentially no anchoring in that larger society. So adolescents end up becoming kind of free-floating and disconnected in the process. And although that's essentially normal in our contemporary understanding of psychosociology, I'm not convinced that it really is the avenue to wholeness for kids. When you read through Hurt, or you think about maybe your own conversations that you've had with teenagers, it's awfully hard to get the sense that this normative way of being today really is offering adolescents what they need in order to feel whole, to feel like they have hope, to resolve the internal conflicts that they might feel in their lives. It doesn't seem to be able to offer them what they need in order to be whole. So, what does this really tell us about adolescent development today? Well, I think it gives us a sort of a picture or a context for understanding the challenge of growing up today. And so we're going to look at the overall process of adolescent development, and we're going to look at three key aspects of that. What psychosociologists call individuation. We're going to look at the specific tasks or internal drives of adolescent development, and then the corresponding questions that come with those. And then we're going to look at some deep longings of adolescence. So let's start the overall process, specifically individuation. Individuation is a psychological theory about adolescence, and when I put the definition up here on the screen, you're going to look at it like, of course, that's what individuation means. It means, and this kind of was popularized by Peter Bloss in the 20th century. He said it's essentially the process of becoming an individual. Well, it's significant because adolescents have existed prior to this as a child in the context of a family, and they are beginning to emerge out from under the umbrella of the family, which has provided them essentially, if it's been a family that functioned with primary characteristics, out from under that context and into not directly into adulthood, but into this transitional phase of adolescence towards adulthood. Now, this is what we often call the second individuation process. Margaret Mahler, who was M-A-H-L-E-R, Margaret Mahler was a theorist that really said the first individuation occurs in infants, when they're beginning to recognize that they are not, they're a separate being from the one that they are attached to maternally, the person who exhibits primary maternal attachment. So in most cases that's their mother. In some cases they're not able to be with their mother, so whoever it is that they're maternally attached to. But somewhere around 18 months or so, they begin to sense that they are a separate entity, that they are not the same as their mother. That's the first individuation. So Bloss took that idea and said, well, in adolescence, it seems like, especially as that transition seems to be more observable and longer, that it's a second individuation, a new process of becoming a separate entity or being out from under the context of the family.
Okay, let's continue to look at the overall process of individuation, but let's look at it through the lens of three tasks of adolescence. I think you're familiar with these: the task of identity, the task of autonomy, and the task of belonging. Now, these are subsets of this bigger idea of individuation. Sometimes individuation and an adolescent identity might be synonyms or synonymous ways for describing what's going on, so it might be a little confusing to have one of these subset tasks also called identity, and I get that, but I think this makes sense if we think about these tasks, these internal drives, as they relate to these developmental questions. Their corresponding question for identity is really, who am I? So that's the question internally an adolescent is trying to resolve. Now, they're not necessarily conscious of this. Most are not conscious of this. Nonetheless, it's this deep psychosocial drive to resolve the question, who am I? Also, with regard to autonomy, the question that they're really trying to resolve is, do my decisions matter? Do I have any power or any agency in the world around me? And then thirdly, with regard to belonging, the deep question they're trying to resolve is, where do I fit in? Again, they're not necessarily conscious of these deep internal drives, but they certainly exhibit behavior that corresponds to these as we watch what they do. So I want you to be aware of these important things, which, as I've said before, they're not necessarily conscious. It's very internal, these drives are. However, I want us to be much more in the habit of observing behaviors in adolescence and connecting the dots to their tasks, these internal drives that are going on. So, for example, if we see an adolescent who maybe starts to make some changes in presentation, how they represent themselves, clothing styles, musical tastes, that sort of thing. A lot of times that's just an experiment with a new self, a new kind of identity. They want to try it on and see how it fits. And that's driven from this deep internal question, who am I? I don't really know. So I'll try some things to see if they fit for me. We might watch adolescent behavior, and sometimes we see them act out or push back against boundaries a little bit. They may do that in silly, immature ways. They may do it in oppositional or defiant ways. But either way, at its core, that's coming from this deep question, do my decisions matter? Do I have any power? I sense that I should have some self-agency. I should be able to make some decisions that matter somewhere in the world, maybe even decisions that affect others. But I have no idea what that's like yet. I don't know how to decide what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. I don't know how to decide how to direct this growing sense of autonomy or agency that I have. But we can connect that out there. We know where that's coming from when we see it. It doesn't mean we excuse bad behavior if they're really immature and looking for negative attention, or if they're really oppositional and defiant. We don't need to go, oh, well, that's just because they're trying to resolve the question, do my decisions matter, as if we excuse bad behavior. We need to be able to come alongside adolescents and help them navigate ways to use that deep sense of autonomy in appropriate and positive ways. But that's part of our challenge. And then with regard to belonging, of course, you can observe this. If you're in the U.S. and you go to a middle school or high school cafeteria, if you're new at that environment there, that's where this sense of where do I fit in probably rises to its highest level. You walk into that cafeteria for the first time and you're wondering, who do I sit with? Where do I belong? That's a big challenge. And that happens in 100 other venues all the time, especially for adolescents. Who do I belong? Where do I belong? Who do I fit in with? And again, not conscious, driven deeply and internally, nonetheless very significant, and we can watch behavior at the surface or observational level and then become good at connecting it to these deep internal drives. So we need to be very good at doing that. You're going to need to be able to do that for the upcoming midterm that we're going to do. You're going to watch a movie, and I want you to be keenly aware of where you see the task of identity, autonomy, and belonging emerging, or related, where you see these questions trying to be resolved. Who am I? Do my decisions matter? Where do I fit in? And the reason we're doing this is because I want you to be very good at doing this wherever you are in ministry with adolescents, or as a supporter of ministry to adolescents, or in a school, or whatever other environment you may be in where you come in contact with adolescents. I want you to be really good at understanding where their observable behaviors are coming from. All part of the task of individuation and these three particular subsets.
Okay, we're going to look at the overall process with regard to what I call deep longings. Deep longings do have a lot of overlap with those three categories or the three tasks of adolescence. I'm going to put these up on the screen for you, mainly because I think a number of times adolescents will resonate with these deep longings more so than they will with a specific category of identity or autonomy. So, for example, deep down, adolescents are longing for a safe place. Where can I belong where it feels safe? Particularly safe to be uniquely me. Where is it that I belong? In other words, is there anyone who's going to tell me you belong here? You're going to take up for me. You're going to fight for me. You're going to say this is your place right here. They have this deep longing to know that they matter because it communicates they have value. A longing to be taken seriously. Again, you see the overlap. This is related to the task of autonomy. Do my decisions count? If I belong to a church community or part of a student council or I'm on the Little League baseball team, if I make a suggestion for how we do something, does anybody respond and say, that's a really good idea? Or are my ideas or my notions continually rejected? A really, really important longing for adolescents to know in a peer group or in an environment with adults, can I make a suggestion or can I make an observation that is taken seriously at all? Again, it's connected to the idea of knowing that their power, their ability actually matters. It can actually change things. They have a longing for hope. Typically, adolescents don't think about it this way very much. They oftentimes have this very tacit understanding of hope. Things are just going to work out for them. But at its core, at this deep level, they long to know that there's something they can trust in and believe in about their future. They're going to typically believe it'll work out, but they don't often know how that's going to happen, how it's going to get there. They have a longing to know that that there is a hope for them for arriving at this destination. They can see that they're in this transitional phase, but they can't see the other side. So there's a longing for hope that they'll end up at a place where they are a fully integrated core self as an adult. And then lastly, they have a longing for more. And I want to stop and emphasize this the most because deep down at their core, they know they were made for more and not less. All right, that's a great question to ask an analyst. Don't you know at your core you were made for more and not less? Or have you ever thought about this? You know in your bones you were made for more and not less, don't you? You wake up in the morning and you have this sort of undetected or slightly detected sense that you hope today is better than it was before. Where does that come from? Why do you possibly have any sense or hope that you were made for more? Why can't you just take every moment of every day, even the bad things, and go, well, bummer, that's just the way things work out because that's just life. We typically don't accept it that way. We typically go, this is not a good day. This is not right. This shouldn't be happening. And all of those come from this deep internal conviction that there ought to be more. As we'll find later in the course, I believe that conviction or that sense comes from the reality that we're created in the image of God as image bearers. And that comes to bear in everyday life in adolescence. I would say this about deep longings in general and about this longing for more specifically. If you're teaching a Bible study to adolescents or if you're speaking to a group of adolescents, I think one of the things that you want to be able to connect your message to anytime you teach or speak to adolescents is one of their deep longings. You want to be able to say, what this means to you is, you know how deep down you feel like there's just times you'd like to know it's just okay to be who you are? Well, here's what this lesson tells us about that. Or here's what this parable that Jesus is teaching us has to say about that. Isn't there a time in your life where you just would love to be taken seriously? Well, what this interaction that Jesus has with the woman at the well, for example, just gives us a demonstration that Jesus really does take that notion seriously as well too. He takes people seriously, and he takes you seriously as well too. Just a little side note there for you, but I want you to think about how to connect what you say or what you do in ministry with either the three tasks of adolescence or their deep longings here. This is how we'll speak to and do ministry to them in such a way that resonates at the core of who they are or at the core of who they're becoming right now. Just a little side note there. Let's move on. The overall process. What's the timing and duration of adolescence? This is how we look at this. Adolescence begins in puberty, and this is just the starting point that we have always measured adolescence, and it ends in culture. It ends when a person is fully integrated as an interdependent member of society or the surrounding culture. So here's our person here, and here's kind of the timing of this. In the 19th century, puberty began around 14 and a half years of age. I got to stop here and just explain this to you for a second. For whatever reason, I don't exactly know, but I got to guess, puberty has always been measured collectively as when girls have their first menstrual cycle. I don't know why that is, but my guess is probably because doctors who were paying attention to this stuff were all males. And so they're like, we're not going to measure anything in us. We're going to measure what happens in females. So it would be fair to say that puberty begins at the point where there is a physiological demonstration of the capacity to reproduce. That would be very technical, sterile language, but if you think about that just for a minute, a menstrual cycle in a girl certainly indicates the physiological demonstration of the capacity to reproduce. There is also a physiological demonstration of the capacity to reproduce in males, and for whatever reason, nobody's ever talked about that. No one's ever measured it, and I don't know why, but for whatever reason, all the data always begins with females. So that's kind of unfortunate in my opinion, but it's just the way it's always been. So in the 19th century, the average age of puberty in girls began at 14 and a half, so that's where we say adolescence begins in that time. And then it ended maybe around 16 or so as young girls began to be more integrated interdependently into the larger adult world in various ways. That could have been because of marriage, not always, but it could have often been because they assume more roles in the family, they have a lot more responsibility, or in some cases, if you read a book like The Rise of the American Teenager, which tells a little bit of the history of teenage life, particularly in the 19th century, you might have gone off to work in a factory or a mill as industrialization was taking place. So the Rise and Fall of the American Teenager by Thomas Hine is a good historical book to look at sometime when you got some free time. Okay, so as we move into, say, the 70s or 80s, what we noticed was that puberty started beginning around age 13, but it was ending in culture maybe around 18 or 20. So I'd say this is probably more 70s, very early 80s, if at all. But it was around the 20s, it was okay to begin your age 20s, I'm saying there. It was okay to begin to think of yourself as about to enter into adulthood. But today, puberty begins around age 12, but it doesn't really, and you see the descent of this age, early and earlier start of puberty. But it's not ending until mid-20s, really at best, and sometimes longer than that. So here's how this has changed over time. The way we would have looked at adolescence in centuries prior is that there would have been a pole that represents kind of like one side of the developmental process. So at this pole right here, you would have been in the dependent stage. You would have belonged primarily in your family. And on the other side here would be a pole that would represent your interdependence, or your now integration into the adult world. And this little gap in between, you can almost picture it like a little short tightrope, would be relatively short. Maybe from age 14, or it would include age 14 or 15. So puberty began around 13, and about 16, you became more integrated into the adult world. What we see now is this maybe in the 30s to the 90s, and again, this is when psychologists like Peter Bloss were writing, Erik Erikson was making observation about development as well. Jean Piaget, another French psychosociologist, was also making observations about development. But essentially, in your dependent stage and your interdependent stage began to spread apart or widen, so this tightrope became longer. And we made this observation, there was now this very independent stage. Again, because it demonstrates that adolescents were having to navigate this distance by themselves. They had to be independently doing that. Is that a good thing? I don't think so. It hasn't always been that way. But it's the reality, sociologically especially, of the environment where adolescents have to develop. So we notice maybe there's a couple of stages here. There's an early adolescent stage, beginning about 13 or so, kind of transitioning about 14 or 15. And the second half, later adolescence, would have been from about 15 to about 20. Well, in the 1990s to 2000s, you can see the poles have widened even more so. So now we have the dependent side, we have the interdependent side, the tightrope is longer. In this independent stage of adolescence, figuring it out on your own can be divided into 3 stages now. So we have early adolescence, we have middle adolescence, and we have late adolescence. So puberty starts earlier, so from about 12 into 14 or 15. So this roughly corresponds to our school categories in some ways, 5th or 6th grade into about 8th grade. Then a transition into roughly the high school years, with a little bit beyond that perhaps, maybe at the beginning of the college years or the first years out. And then an extended period from 20 to 21 on into the mid-20s before we enter into that interdependent year. Now this is shifted today so that what we used to call late adolescence, we now typically call emerging adulthood. And Jeffrey Arnett is a psychologist who's probably the one who's written the most about, and has kind of pioneered this thinking about late adolescence as more of an emerging adulthood over time. I put an article on this week's section here from Christian Smith, who has written about Arnett's views about late adolescence. He's done some research himself about late adolescence, and so there's a useful resource there for you to actually it's in next week's material, I believe. You'll see that as we talk a little more specifically about late adolescence. But the main idea is that this is sort of a gradual process. It's not a jumping off the tightrope. It's kind of a gradual descent over a longer period of time, perhaps into the 30s, into that interdependent stage there. Okay, I want to take a few minutes. Okay, so that was one view of the tightrope kind of visual for adolescent development. Now here is clearly a much more detailed version of that. I'm calling it to your attention right now because I've created this as a PDF. It's in this week's, in fact I think it's right below the PowerPoint presentation for today, called The Tightrope of Adolescent Development. So you can download that, you can print it out. I'm going to show you in a minute where I think it's relative to you, but I just want to call your attention to it right now. Okay, so talking about this period here, or this tightrope rather, this demonstration of the stages of adolescent development. I just want to take a minute to focus on middle adolescence. Not very much. I know you've been reading about middle adolescence in HURT 2.0. And if you haven't already, I want you to watch the Chap Clark video that's right below this PowerPoint presentation. What's going to expand, and you're going to hear him talk in more detail about middle adolescence. We're kind of aiming for the middle of the adolescent development journey right now. So right here in that age group between 14-ish and about 21. I want to take just a minute to talk about a few key terms, so I'm going to shrink this here for you. We're going to focus in on this category right here, or this area right here on the tightrope. A few key terms that I want you to be aware of. Now, I've made a list of a lot of key terms about adolescence that is in a document right below your midterm exam instructions in week 5. If you haven't taken a look at that yet, I really want to encourage you to do that, because you're going to need to know what all these terms are and how to observe them critically when you watch the movie Perks of Being a Wallflower. There's a lot more to be said about that as we approach week 5, but I just want to call your attention to it right now. So here are a few key terms in middle adolescence that I want you to be aware of. These are not all of them. This is not the comprehensive list, but this is just a start at making sure you understand what these are, you can articulate them back, and then you can identify them when you see them. So first of all, egocentric abstraction. Middle adolescents are egocentrically abstract in their thinking. Now, if you just look at those terms, I mean, typically we think of ego as a negative thing because we think of it as self-centeredness. But in terms of ego development and this psychological idea, ego and ego development is not a bad thing. It's not associated with negativity. It's a process or a way of understanding internally what the self is. So what's happening for adolescents is that they're beginning to be in the very early stages of integrating inward into a core ego or self. So in and of itself, this is not a bad thing. But what it does mean is that the focus or the trajectory is inward here. So one way Chap Clark often talks about this is that they're now aware that what they do affects others, but they don't really care. And again, that sounds awfully negative or selfish. And if it was left just on its own, that wouldn't be enough to understand exactly what's meant here. But what it means is they don't care because developmentally they're not able to be other-centered yet. So they may come across as being really, really selfish. They may come across as being totally not self-aware. And the truth is they're not. Not because they want to be selfish or mean or lack self-awareness. It's because developmentally they're not able to think selflessly or other-centered yet. So, for example, if we were going to teach them about Jesus saying that if you want to be my disciple, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me daily. For a middle adolescent, they're just in the beginning stages of grasping that they're on a pathway towards becoming a self. So they don't really possess a self yet. So the idea of dying to self probably doesn't land in their lives the same way it would with an adult. So technically they can't really die to self because they don't have a sense. They have this understanding or this perception that deep down they don't have personal power on a consistent basis. Again, that would be a synonym for autonomy, one of the tasks of adolescence. But you need to have personal power in order to die to self, to be able to have the decision, the autonomy, the self-rule to say, I choose to die to myself now. But I want to be clear about this. It doesn't mean that we blow up our ideas of practicing selflessness, that we no longer go on mission trips or do work to those in the inner city who are in under-resourced communities. We keep doing those, but we understand that what we're doing most likely is that we are exposing adolescents to the concept because they get to see it modeled in adults, and this gives them a chance to experiment with it, sort of. And as they begin in this developmental process to move out of egocentric abstraction into other focused or other directed perceptions, they'll have kind of a placeholder for this. They will have some practice or experiment or some experience rather in doing that sort of thing. So I think it's why we continue to do those sorts of things with kids, but recognizing that they're not going to really be able to process the idea of dying to self like you and I might think of that as adults. Okay, they gather in clusters. You've read a lot about clusters. They are networks formed for mutual self-protection. That doesn't mean that they're just groups of friends, although they certainly call them friends. but they're not friends in that sense that they're friends who are looking out for the best interests of one another. They are a collection of kids, more or less, gathered together with this implicit assumption that they're there to protect one another. So you see this in the video of a circle of people linking arms, arm in arm in a circle, but facing outward. They're sort of circling the wagons in order to protect themselves from what they perceive as the threat of maybe their family. Their family becomes a bit of a threat because internally they know they're trying to separate out and individuate out from the family. The family is trying to hang on to them in some ways. That feels like a bit of a threat against their natural tendency or desire to individuate. It's not a threat, it's just a perception of a threat. They tend to be family-like. Well, why is that? Because we saw earlier on in the lecture today that the family itself is much less primary, or has less primary characteristics as it used to. The peer group begins to fill that void. It begins to operate in more of a primary sort of way, or with primary-like characteristics. So for a season, this peer group or this cluster is the safest place for kids. It's filled the void in some ways. So here's the thing though, it fills the void, but it doesn't have the necessary social capital or psychosocial capital in order to really meet the needs or the demands of that primary group or primary kind of characteristics that it needs in order to integrate into a social structure to be a self. So they spend a great deal of their energy and their relational capital on kind of holding the cluster together. It's just not strong enough by itself. It's not supported enough in the social setting by itself to stay together. So almost all of their energy goes into that cluster to keep it together. And it is a safe place in their mind. It's worth it to do it. But it's one reason why other relationships like their families or maybe even dating relationships or serving others get a lot less energy. They sort of have to pool their limited resources together to keep the cluster going rather than having it filled or invested in from the outside because they've essentially been abandoned. One other thing about the cluster to point out too is that the cluster sort of sets the rules. Again, the idea of it being kind of a primary type relationship, it sort of sets the rules and values. This is what we're going to be like. This is going to be in some ways, maybe what we wear. This is going to be the things we're interested in. These are going to be the things that we do or don't do. Here's some of the language we're going to use. The cluster early on negotiates for these rules and then establishes them. Now, once you're in this kind of cluster environment, it's really rare that one adolescent or mid-adolescent in this group would challenge the rules or make a frontal assault at those, because you risk essentially being excluded from the cluster. So, for example, in some ways, if you've got a group of kids in a cluster, one of those kids becomes a Christian, they go off to a church retreat or a young life camp or something like that, meet Christ, become a Christian, where they're going to want to operate under a different value system, but coming back into the cluster oftentimes can be really difficult without a lot of parental or adult support to do this, because they'll feel like they have to challenge the negotiated rules of the cluster now. And that can often, again, as I said, often mean getting kicked out of the cluster or the cluster dissolving. It takes a lot to teach them how to, and to confidently enter back into a cluster, to be an influence in the cluster over time, to renegotiate some of the rules there. We'll talk more about how they gather together according to self-concept theory. That'll come up later here, but I think you're familiar with that. So I'll give you a visual demonstration of what that looks like, and really the implications of lots of kids in lots of clusters according to different self-concepts. Okay, you know about systemic abandonment. By the way, don't ever call it systematic abandonment. It's not systematic abandonment. It's systemic. It means it crosses all the systems where they live. Family system, school system, peer system, other adult systems. Those systems where kids live have disintegrated to the point now where they have abandoned them. So this means adolescents now are aware that they're on this tightrope. They're in this period of independence and they're journeying across, but it is so long that they can't see the end. And they sense the stress of that. and they're now becoming much more aware of the agendas that others have for them that they've been under perhaps in the past, and they're aware that others, as they are making their way across the agendas they have for them, and now adults in particular. They're in an independent stage. They have to be in this independent stage because it's a long journey from dependence as a family to interdependence integrated into the adult world. So agendas that others have for them begin to be really negative things because there's no sense that anyone's really got my back, that no one's really looking out for my best interest. Again, one of the reasons why mid-adolescents gather in these clusters as mutual self-protection. So they essentially are in a survivor mode. And it's one of the reasons why identity formation or discovery is so difficult, because in many cases it's almost like they're putting a moratorium on it. It's almost as if they're just saying, I'm not going to take your influence or your suggestions or the trajectory that you intend for me or the agendas that you have for me in order to move across this. I've got to do this on my own. I sense that, and so I'm journeying on my way. And then lastly, they operate in what we call multiple selves. I think in the past, we used to think about middle adolescence as operating with multiple compartments. So they'd have maybe their youth group compartment, their family compartment, and they would have their school compartment. But really, I think there's a growing consensus that they are operating now much more with a different kind of reality, and that is that they are becoming multiple selves. So it'll look something like this. About 15 or 20 years ago, some theorists began to think that the reality of middle adolescence, because of the shifts in culture, post-industrial life, and really in almost any setting, urban or suburban or rural, that the influence or the trajectory to sort of sent kids on was to live life in a pattern of what they call discrete multi-positional segments. So you think about the places where they live, family, or the multiple layers of their school, or their peers, or at their church, or other or social kind of gathering places, or even the various subsets of each one of those. So, for example, church, and then there might be a youth group as a subset of that. Each one of those little environments where they were, they recognize almost requiring its own set of interactional skills rather than this one consistent principled self is sort of moved in and out of each one of those. So in a sense, each one of these different environments call for not only just different behaviors, but for virtually different persons. So one way that you could imagine this is it was like every one of these little environments is like a stage where the adolescent is an actor in a play of sorts, and it's got a script. And each little environment they live in is another play with its own script, with its own rules, with its own characters. And so you can imagine that they've got a script for a youth group, they've got a script for their third period science class, they've got a script for the baseball team, they've got a script for their cluster, they've got a script for who they interact with, friends of their families, they've got a script. And every single one of those, it's a negotiated script. I take cues from you. I learn how I should behave here. I've got to be this actor in this moment, and it's like the old idea of method acting. They become the character they are in each one of these little stage plays wherever they exist. But if you think about this, that every time they walk in from one environment to the next, they've got to do this mental checklist of figuring out what play am I in right now? What stage is this? Who are the characters here? What are my lines? And they have to become that person in that environment. And they might make dozens of shifts in and out of these multiple stage plays where they exist on a day-to-day basis, and they're constantly having to keep up with who they are in this environment right now in order to meet the expectations or demands of that script. if you think about this over time, this could be just a crushing burden. It could cause a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress because they essentially can't be a single integrated self. They have to be multiple selves where they are. So again, this is just a visual illustration for some of the complexity of being a middle adolescent today.
Let me call this document to your attention here. This is also included as a PDF in the course right below where this lecture is here. And this is a pretty detailed, well, not pretty, it's a very detailed picture of the journey of adolescence. So if you've read Hurt 2.0, some of you have read the whole thing for other classes, or if you read other writings of Chap Clark, like we'll read in Adoptive Youth Ministry, these ideas will be referred to. But basically, you can see early adolescence, mid-adolescence, late adolescence, or emerging adulthood, kind of on that tightrope across there. You see the need on the right-hand side for maternal attachment in childhood. So early adolescent ministry reflects more of a maternal style. Mid-adolescent ministry reflects more of a paternal style because of the need for paternal attachment. We have these little circles here that represent families or adults, other non-family adults who are invested in the life of the adolescent as they make that transition across. And then we enter into late adolescence, where the goal in late adolescence is to be integrated into adulthood on that far right-hand side. So I just want you to be aware of this tightrope idea and another visual kind of thing here. Incorporate a little bit of thinking with regard to development, concrete operations over here in the far left-hand side. Adolescents thinking in concrete terms in early adolescence, but shifting to abstract thinking as they move into mid-adolescence. This is just a comprehensive view here. You might want to use this next week when we talk about early adolescence and emerging adulthood. It's just here for your benefit. Hopefully helps you kind of see this on a larger scale. Okay, lastly, I want to call your attention to a video from Chap Clark that will follow. It'll be a little further down in Moodle here. It's not an option. I want you to listen to this. It's a good overall summary of what we've talked about today. It's pretty short, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Won't take you too long. A lot of great stuff from Chap you can find on YouTube, by the way. I just think he's probably the expert in understanding, especially middle adolescent ministry. So that's kind of the core, oftentimes, of youth ministry. We build ministry on either side of that early and late or emerging adulthood youth ministry. Nonetheless, the point really is, here's a video for you to watch from Chap. But the other thing I want to call your attention to further down is there is a video from Daniel Siegel. That is a video where it talks about some brain research, which I think is really fascinating. I'm not going to make you do any extra reading on brain research in adolescence, but there's a lot that's going on that might bring a great deal of clarity as to why adolescents are like they are from a neurobiological perspective. This is just one option. There are several great TED Talks. Sarah Blakemore is another one. Nonetheless, here's what I want you to do. If you want an extra point added to your grade, you watch this video, and then you click on the place to post a takeaway or an idea. You'll read the question there for you to fill in, just to show me that you watched this and you got something out of it. And if you do that, I'll give you an extra point on your final grade. So it's only going to be available for this week. It's only available for week 3. So if you choose not to do it now and want to go back and do it later, sorry, it doesn't work that way. You got to take advantage of it. You got to strike while the iron's hot, while the dew is on the rose, all kinds of trite expressions like that. But there we go. Okay, that's the end of this week's lecture. Have a great week, everybody. Reach out to me if you have questions about anything, but I'll be reaching out to you as we interact on forums and readings in lecture and reading forums this week. Okay, take care. Have a great week.